In a jam-packed graduation hall, a black man stood quietly near the back, unnoticed, dismissed, mistaken for a member of the cleaning staff. But as soon as the final award was announced, and his stepdaughter unexpectedly burst into tears, the room fell silent. The man everyone had overlooked was called up to the stage, not because of her, but for the person he was. Stick around until the very end, because what's about to happen will challenge everything you believed about present sacrifice and quiet heroism. Let us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The Belgrave University auditorium glowed in the fading afternoon light. Long rays of sunshine streamed in through the arched windows, catching on the shiny, polished wood floors and casting soft reflections onto the white linen-covered tables. People moved through the reception hall with an almost choreographed elegance. Well-dressed parents in sharp suits and flowing dresses, professors in their academic robes, proud grandparents clutching programs as if they were valuable certificates. Voices echoed in measured, controlled laughter. It was exactly the kind of moment designed for celebration, a clean, neat closing paragraph to years of hard work and dedication. And right in the middle of it all stood Amelia Cole, diploma clutched tightly in her hand, her graduation cap slightly askew, the gold tassel catching just enough light to make her look taller than she actually felt. She kept her spine perfectly straight as she walked, the clicking of her low black heels steady and measured. Walking beside her was Benjamin Cole, the man who had raised her since she was 10 years old. He wore a navy blue blazer that had definitely seen better days, carefully pressed khaki slacks, and a pale green tie that Amelia had helped him straighten before they left the hotel room. It still sat a little crooked at the collar, but he either hadn't noticed, or maybe he had, and simply chose not to adjust it. His shoes, though clean, were worn at the toes. Soft, flattened leather that had seen more time working than walking on expensive carpets like these. Benjamin was the type of man who occupied space without calling attention to himself. He walked with a quiet dignity, not like someone who expected to belong in a place like this, but like someone who simply refused to shrink himself to fit in. As Amelia made her way across the reception area, her eyes focused ahead, but she could feel it even before she actually saw it. That slight change in the atmosphere, the brief pause in conversation, the subtle shift of eyes. Her mother's side of the family, the Griffiths, stood in a loose circle near the refreshment table, each person perfectly composed, like a piece of a living portrait. Pearls, tailored jackets, polished shoes, and expressions that suggested patience more than genuine joy. They weren't waiting for Amelia, but rather waiting to be seen waiting. As Amelia got closer, a whispered comment travelled just fast enough to reach her ears, but quiet enough to pretend it wasn't intentionally meant for her to hear. "Is that the electrician she brought?" The voice belonged to someone she barely even remembered, a cousin of her mother's. Maybe the tone wasn't overtly sharp, but it didn't need to be. A muffled half-laugh followed, swallowed by a sip of sparkling water. "I thought her mum left him years ago. I heard he's just her stepfather. Married in. Doesn't really count, does it?" The words landed quietly but firmly, like small pebbles tossed into a pool of shallow water. They didn't create a splash, but Amelia felt each one ripple through her ribcage. She didn't stop walking. Her eyes stayed straight ahead, but she felt her grip tighten slightly on the graduation program in her hand. She didn't turn to see if Benjamin had heard. She already knew he had. She could feel the subtle shift in his breathing, almost imperceptible as it was. She could sense the way his eyes dropped to the floor for just a brief second before rising again as if absolutely nothing had affected him. That was just his way. Always had been. Take the hit. Keep walking. Benjamin's hands stayed tucked neatly inside his pockets. He offered a polite smile to a passing professor, nodding once with a quiet grace that made it perfectly clear that he understood his place in that room, and it wasn't front and center. He didn't argue back. He didn't shrink away either. But Amelia saw what others didn't. She saw the way his jaw tensed, not noticeably, just barely. The way his fingers moved slightly in his pocket, like he was holding on to something he absolutely couldn't afford to drop. She stepped a little closer to him, just enough so that her elbow brushed against his. Her voice stayed quiet, her eyes still focused forward. "You okay?" she asked, barely louder than a whisper. Benjamin glanced sideways, his lips lifting just slightly, his voice low and steady. "You're the one in heels," he said. She smiled without even meaning to. He always did that. Always knew exactly what to say to cut the tension in half, but not make it disappear completely. That was just the thing about Benjamin. He never tried to pretend that things didn't hurt. He just didn't allow the pain to take control. As they approached the drink table, one of the event staff, a young college-age student in a white shirt and black apron, stepped around Benjamin with a tray, barely pausing to even acknowledge him. The student looked right past him toward a woman in a floral print wrap dress who smiled politely and took a glass of cider. Amelia noticed the subtle shift, how the student had offered drinks to everyone in the Griffiths' little group, but skipped right over Benjamin as if he wasn't even part of the celebration. Benjamin didn't flinch. He never did. They stood there together in silence for just a moment. The room buzzed all around them. Cameras clicked in rhythmic bursts. Laughter rose and fell like background music. The Griffiths kept their distance, although Amelia noticed a few of them glancing in her direction, their lips pressed together in quiet disapproval, their eyes darting to Benjamin and then quickly looking away again. Her Aunt Alva, always the most refined voice of judgment, looked directly at Amelia, as if waiting for her to offer an explanation. When Amelia didn't offer anything, Alva turned to Sapphire, her daughter, and whispered something that earned a light, controlled laugh. Amelia exhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take when you know that this won't be the last thing said, just the latest in a long line of small, sharp wounds that no one ever really bothers to call cuts. The photographer hired by the university passed nearby and stopped just a few feet from Amelia. "Graduates and family?" he asked politely, gesturing toward the polished backdrop set up near the front of the hall. Amelia nodded and stepped forward, but Benjamin hesitated. His hands left his pockets for just a second, then quickly returned. "You go ahead," he said quietly. Amelia looked up at him. "Come with me," she said. He glanced toward the Griffiths. They weren't looking directly at him, but they were watching all the same. He took a moment, then nodded. They walked toward the camera setup, and the photographer adjusted his lens. "Parents on the left," he said casually, then paused. "Oh, are you her father?" Benjamin looked at Amelia. She looked directly at the photographer. "Yes," she said. There was a beat of silence, just long enough for her voice to fill it completely. The man nodded and raised the camera. "All right. 1, 2. The flash went off. Benjamin didn't say anything afterward. He never did. Not about things like this. But Amelia noticed something in his stance. His shoulders, which had been slightly hunched since they entered, were just a little straighter now. As they turned to walk away, Amelia caught a glimpse of her cousin Sapphire whispering to someone behind a paper program. Her eyes rolled with a theatrical flair. Her voice was just loud enough to carry, "I guess they'll let anyone into these ceremonies now." It wasn't loud, it wasn't direct, but it was definitely enough. Amelia stopped for just a second. Her back was still turned, her eyes focused on absolutely nothing. And then she took Benjamin's arm, looped hers through it tightly, and kept walking. Benjamin didn't speak, neither did she, but in that simple action she answered everything. Amelia didn't say anything as they walked away from the photo station. Her hand was still looped through Benjamin's arm, her steps slow and deliberate. She could feel her breath working hard to stay even, her throat tightening with something she wouldn't exactly call anger, because anger would have given them way too much credit. It wasn't rage, it was something quieter. A dull, familiar ache in her chest, like pressing on a bruise you'd almost forgotten was still healing. They moved to a quiet corner of the reception hall where a row of empty chairs stood near the tall windows, away from the crowd. Benjamin sat down first, cautiously, as if unsure if the seat was even intended for him. He rested his hands on his knees, fingers laced together. Amelia stood beside him for a moment, watching the way the sunlight softened the deep lines in his face, how the light caught on the grey at his temples. There was just so much about him that never asked to be noticed, and yet there he was, always there. She eased into the chair beside him, not looking directly at him, but feeling the solid weight of his presence next to her, just as she had for years. The tension in the room faded slightly in that quiet space, but it couldn't erase the sting that lingered from what had been said, or even worse, what hadn't. Her mind drifted uninvited to the memory of another quiet moment, 12 years ago, almost to the very day. Her father had left on a Tuesday, which she remembered clearly, not because of anything he said, but because of what he definitely didn't. He had packed a single suitcase and told her mother that he just needed some time to figure things out. There had been no shouting, no final embrace, just the dull click of the front door closing behind him. Amelia had stood at the top of the stairs, holding the banister with both hands, not entirely sure if she should go downstairs or just pretend that she hadn't heard anything at all. She waited for her mother to come looking for her, but no one ever did. The very next morning, Benjamin had been the one to knock gently on her bedroom door. He didn't come inside. He didn't call her kiddo or try to tell her that things would be okay. He just said softly, "Breakfast is ready," and waited until he actually heard her footsteps before he walked away. She remembered entering the kitchen and seeing 2 bowls of oatmeal on the table, steam curling into the still air. Her mother wasn't there. Benjamin was standing at the counter pouring juice into a glass, his shoulders square, his back to her. She didn't speak. She didn't sit down. He turned around slowly and held out the glass. "Orange or apple?" he asked. Amelia shrugged, her eyes fixed on the linoleum floor. He nodded. "Both it is." Then he said, placing both glasses on the table and sitting down across from her, like it was the most ordinary morning in the entire world. She didn't eat very much, neither did he. But he stayed there with her, silent but present, like a solid pillar in the very middle of a room that didn't even need words to keep the walls from falling down. Later that same week, it had been Benjamin who had picked her up from school. The office secretary had hesitated when she called her name over the intercom. "Your stepfather's here," she'd said. Amelia had paused, her mouth tightening. The word had sounded strange, like it didn't even belong to her. She walked slowly to the front of the school where Benjamin was waiting outside, leaning against an old pickup truck that had a dented front fender and a door that creaked loudly when it opened. He wore his work shirt, navy blue with a stitched name tag, and his hands had grease marks on them that soap never seemed to completely remove. She heard it before she even saw him. "Is that your uncle or your Uber driver?" A boy in her class laughed, nudging his friend. Another chimed in. "Bet he fixes air conditioners." They weren't being very loud, but they were definitely loud enough. Amelia had flushed. She remembered that heat in her cheeks, the sting behind her eyes. She had wished more than anything that someone else had come instead. She climbed into the truck quickly, head down, backpack in her lap. She didn't look at him, not even once. Benjamin didn't ask her about it. He didn't say that he understood. He didn't make a joke to lighten the mood. He just reached into the drink tray and handed her a small paper cup. It was warm. She looked at it. "Hot chocolate," he said quietly. "Figured it might be that kind of day." She took it, still staring at the floor. He started the engine. The truck roared to life. As they pulled out of the school parking lot, she took a sip. It was too hot. It burned a little. She drank it anyway. That night she found a note in her backpack. It was written in his handwriting, a little crooked, like he'd been trying to keep it neat. "If you don't want me to pick you up again, I understand. Just let me know. I'll still make you hot chocolate when you get home." She never brought it up, never answered the note. But the very next day she waited for him outside the school. That had been the start of everything. Over the next few months he began helping her with her science fair projects, even though he said that circuits gave him a terrible headache. He spent an entire weekend turning the living room into a disaster zone of cardboard and wires, reading every single instruction like it was a sacred text. She got 3rd place. He cheered like she'd won the state championship. He fixed her nightlight after it shorted out. She hadn't even asked him to. He sat through her violin recital, even though she hit so many wrong notes. The conductor winced. He clapped like she was performing at Carnegie Hall. And every single time her mother forgot a school meeting or missed a dentist appointment or spent another evening on the phone in the kitchen with the door closed, Benjamin never said a word. He just filled in all the gaps, one after another, like it was part of some invisible contract that only he had signed. Amelia blinked, pulling herself out of the memory. She was still sitting right next to him now, back in the present, in the bright, echoing reception hall of her graduation. Benjamin had shifted slightly in his seat. He looked out the tall windows, as if trying not to disturb the moment. His hands rested calmly on his lap, his tie still just a bit off-center. "You thinking about something?" he asked, not turning his head. She hesitated. "Yeah," she said. "Anything good?" She nodded. "Yeah, some of it." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't really press for more. She reached over and adjusted his tie. He let her. "It's still crooked," she said. He looked down and chuckled. "Some things just don't want to be fixed." She tilted her head. "I don't know. I think they just need a second try." His eyes met hers. He didn't reply, but in that look she saw it again. That same quiet patience, that same presence that had gotten her through absolutely everything without asking for credit or attention or even thanks. She took a deep breath and leaned back in her chair. Behind them, the room buzzed on. Laughter floated in from the other side. Camera flashes blinked like fireflies, and the Griffiths, still across the room, still watching, hadn't moved. But Amelia didn't care. Not right now, because while everyone else just saw a man in an old blazer and scuffed shoes, she knew better. She always had. He was the one who stayed. Amelia's phone vibrated softly in her purse. She reached for it without even thinking, her fingers brushing past the folded program and the lip balm she had nervously reapplied 3 times already. The screen lit up with a single name, Mom. But it wasn't a missed call, just a silent notification. No new messages. She stared at it for a moment, the kind of moment that stretches out longer than it really deserves to. Then she turned the phone face down on the table between them. Benjamin didn't ask anything. She could feel him there beside her, still calm, his legs slightly apart, his elbows resting on his knees in a relaxed but alert posture. The kind of stance that always made her think of him waiting outside parent-teacher meetings or leaning against the wall during school plays. She knew he had seen her check her phone. He had seen the name, the lack of a message, the silence that followed, but he didn't say anything, and that was somehow even worse than if he had. Amelia picked the phone up again and stood up. "I need some air," she said, her voice flat but not exactly angry. Benjamin nodded once, didn't move to follow her, just said, "I'll be right here." She stepped out into the hallway. The air outside the reception room was cooler, quieter. The hallway was wide, lined with tall windows and framed certificates of academic excellence from past years. Her heels tapped softly against the floor as she moved to a small bench near the corner. She sat down and stared at the wall for a long second before unlocking her phone and dialing the number she knew by heart. It rang twice before Rosalind answered. "Amelia," her mother's voice came, brisk but not unfriendly. "I was just thinking of you. How's the ceremony going?" Amelia hesitated. "Still going," she said. "Oh," Rosalind replied. "I hope everything went smoothly. I heard the Chancellor can be terribly long-winded." Amelia let the pause hang in the air. "You didn't call," she said quietly. "Well, I assumed you'd be busy. I didn't want to interrupt. You didn't come." Rosalind's voice shifted slightly, the edge softening. "I told you, sweetie. I wasn't feeling well. Flying out just didn't make sense right now. I've had that sinus thing again. And with the pressure change—" Amelia interrupted. "Is it because of him?" Another pause, longer this time. "Amelia," Rosalind said, her tone slower now, almost careful. "This is not the time to revisit things that have already been settled. It's not settled for me." Rosalind exhaled. Amelia could hear it. That long, disappointed kind of breath, the kind someone gives when they're just too tired to argue, but also too proud to actually concede. "I know you're close with him," she said finally. "But that chapter of my life—" "He raised me," Amelia said. "I know." "Do you?" Rosalind didn't answer right away. Her silence wasn't exactly cold, but it was definitely rehearsed, the kind of silence you develop over years of consciously choosing what not to deal with. "I'm happy for you," she said, "for your graduation. That's what today is all about." Amelia closed her eyes. "Okay." "I'll send something later this week," Rosalind added. "A card. Maybe something for the apartment." "Thanks." They ended the call with a clipped goodbye. Not warm, not cruel, just finished. Amelia sat there for another minute, the phone resting in her lap, the buzz of the overhead lights faint in the background. When she returned to the hall, Benjamin was still there, just as he said he would be, seated in the same chair, hands folded loosely. He glanced at her, but didn't ask anything. She sat down beside him. Her posture straightened automatically, but her hands were tight in her lap. Benjamin looked forward, not at her, and for a moment he just let the quiet hang there. He had never liked filling silences just to keep people comfortable. He didn't even need to ask to know that the call hadn't gone well. He remembered Rosalind the way you remember a place you once stayed when the world just felt incredibly unstable. Not because it was actually home, but just because it had walls and a roof. And for a while, that was definitely enough. He had never resented her. Not truly. He had loved her. Or at least he had tried to. She was beautiful in that very specific kind of way that people always noticed. Perfect posture, a perfect smile, always polished. The kind of woman who walked into a room and made people check their own appearance. When she had asked him to dinner the very first time, he thought it was definitely a mistake. He had double-checked the message twice, but she had looked at him with those sharp eyes and said, "I know what I'm doing." And maybe she actually did. Maybe at the time she was just tired of always being around men who only knew how to pretend. Benjamin never pretended. He was real, solid, predictable in all the ways that really mattered. He never made promises he couldn't keep. He showed up. That had been enough for a while, but slowly, over time, he just watched her pull away, not in one dramatic gesture, but in small ways. Dinners skipped, conversations shortened, invitations to family events that somehow never actually included him. She never said that he didn't belong, but she didn't exactly fight to make him feel like he did either. He remembered the last few months before she left. How she would look right past him at breakfast. How she stopped touching his shoulder when she passed behind his chair. How she didn't correct anyone when they just assumed Amelia was staying with her father. She didn't lie, but she definitely didn't tell the truth either. When she left, she said she needed space. He didn't argue. He just asked what Amelia needed. Rosalind said that she didn't know. Then she left them both. He had raised Amelia without ever trying to replace her father. He just stepped in where things broke and tried to make sure that nothing else cracked under her feet. And now, watching her sitting beside him, older, stronger, wearing that same stubborn set in her jaw that she had even as a young child, he felt something that was somewhere between pride and grief. Pride for who she had become. Grief that she still had to carry that weight. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. She shook her head. He nodded. "Okay." She turned to him, then really looked at him. "Do you ever think about her?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. "Sometimes." "Not as much as I used to." "Do you hate her?" "No." Amelia looked down at her hands. "I think I do. A little." "That's your right," Benjamin said. "But don't let it take more from you than she already has." Amelia didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she leaned back in her chair, letting her shoulders relax a little. "She said she'd send a card," she muttered. Benjamin smiled faintly. "That's something." "It's not." "No," he agreed. "It's not." They sat in silence again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt like a pause between breaths, a necessary space. From across the room, Alva Griffith caught Amelia's eye, her expression unreadable, a cocktail glass perfectly still in her hand. She turned away a moment later, whispering something to a man in a blazer who nodded way too politely. Amelia didn't look away. She didn't smile. She simply took a breath and turned back to Benjamin. "You ever regret it?" she asked. He tilted his head slightly. "What, staying?" He thought for a moment, then looked her right in the eye. "Never." She nodded, and for the first time that day, the knot in her chest loosened, not completely gone, but no longer choking her. The ceremony would continue soon. There would be more names, more applause, more speeches. But for now, in that quiet corner of the reception hall, there was something far more important than celebration. There was clarity, and there was peace. The light within the auditorium had subtly transformed. The bright afternoon glow had mellowed into a cooler, twilight hue, stretching shadows across the quickly filling rows of seats. Ushers navigated the aisles, stacks of programs held precisely, calling out section numbers with practiced enthusiasm. Families clustered around their graduates, posing for photographs, straightening ties, adjusting the fall of gowns, and whispering last-minute words of encouragement. The atmosphere thrummed with anticipation. Yet, amidst all this, Amelia felt something unsettling begin to creep in. Benjamin stood beside her, near the hall's entrance. He glanced down at the folded ticket in his hand, the one she'd printed for him a week prior. The very ticket that now, it seemed, wasn't quite sufficient. A young woman in a Navy staff blazer stood between them and the rows of seats reserved for family, a clipboard held against her chest. She offered Amelia a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sorry," the woman said, tapping her list. "His name isn't on the confirmed seating chart. Only registered guests are assigned seats in the front section." Amelia felt her jaw clench. "I submitted the form. He's on my list. He's my guest." The woman nodded, as if she had heard the same protest a dozen times already. "I understand, but I have to follow the list I was given." Benjamin stepped forward, his voice even and calm. "It's all right. I can stand." Amelia turned to him. "No, you shouldn't have to." "I'm fine," he repeated. He gave the staff member a brief nod and a half smile that asked nothing of her. Then he stepped back from the neatly arranged rows of white chairs, adorned with paper name tags and gold ribbon-tied programs. He found a spot near the back wall, next to a potted fern, and stood with his hands loosely clasped in front of him. Amelia watched him for a long moment, her stomach twisting. The room looked beautiful, deliberately so. White roses lined the aisle. Soft piano music drifted from a speaker tucked into the corner. A music student adjusted her sheet music on stage. But there was something sharp about the beauty today, something that grated against the edges of fairness. She moved toward her seat slowly. Her name was printed on an elegant card at the front row, a spot reserved for top honor students. Just behind her, the Griffith family had already arranged themselves like figures in a staged portrait. Alva sat with a flute of sparkling water, her posture ramrod straight. Sapphire scrolled through her phone, legs crossed with precision, as if every movement were choreographed for an audience. As Amelia lowered herself into her seat, she heard it, not loudly, but close enough. "He knows his place, at least." Sapphire whispered to Alva. Alva didn't respond with words, just a slow, tight nod. Amelia didn't turn around. Her eyes remained fixed forward, but her fingers pressed hard against her knees, her nails digging into the fabric of her dress. She wanted to say something. She always did, but the moment never seemed quite right. The seat beside hers remained empty. Out of the corner of her eye, she could still see Benjamin standing alone. He wasn't looking at her. He looked ahead, focused on the stage, on the podium where the Chancellor would soon speak. His expression was quiet, unreadable to anyone who didn't know him. But Amelia did. She knew that stance. She knew that stillness. She had seen it at violin recitals, at science fairs, at parent-teacher nights, when he had sat quietly in a room of strangers, never fully acknowledged, never addressed directly. He was used to being the shadow at the edge of the frame, but just because he'd learned to live with it didn't mean it didn't cost something. She thought of all the times he had shown up, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, wholly, when no one else had. When her mother had chosen distance over presence, when others had turned affection into performance, Benjamin had stood where no one else had wanted to stand. And yet now, in the most public, most symbolic moment of her academic life, he was once again relegated to the back. Not by his own doing, but by a system that never planned for someone like him. A few minutes later, as the room quieted and the Chancellor took the stage, Amelia glanced back once more. She saw Benjamin straighten slightly, his shoulders lifting. He gave a polite nod to someone passing by who didn't return it. He adjusted his tie, still a bit crooked, and kept his eyes on the front. She turned back around and felt something solid settle in her chest. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet resolve, the kind that doesn't rise in your throat, but anchors itself in your spine. She folded her hands together and looked toward the podium. They could keep him at the back of the room, but she knew exactly who stood at the center of her life. The auditorium had settled into a steady hum. The main doors were now closed, and the air had taken on that familiar blend of reverence and mild restlessness that precedes official ceremonies. Benjamin remained near the pillar by the side wall, a fixed point amidst the movement around him. No one asked him to move, no one asked if he needed a seat. And yet no one looked entirely comfortable standing near him either. He held his program loosely at his side, his posture relaxed, but not passive. From where he stood, he had a clear view of the stage, of Amelia sitting upright in her row, her eyes scanning the crowd, occasionally pausing on him, each time just for a moment. He didn't return the glance every time, but when he did, he smiled, a small one, the kind that said he saw her, and that was enough. Professor Michael Howard was not officially part of the ceremony that day. His name wasn't on the speaker schedule or printed in the program, but he'd shown up anyway, wearing a blazer over his corduroy shirt, holding a single envelope in his inner pocket. He'd been teaching at Belgrave for over 20 years, and during that time he had seen dozens of graduations, heard hundreds of speeches, but something about this one had kept him from skipping it. Maybe it was a conversation he remembered from a hallway 6 years prior, when Amelia had nervously pitched her thesis idea after class, and he'd seen a man, Benjamin, waiting quietly outside the building, arms crossed, not pacing, not checking his watch, just waiting with a patience that you didn't often see anymore. Howard spotted him now and walked over. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around for approval. He simply approached, extended his hand, and said in a low voice, "I'm glad you came." Benjamin looked up, surprised but composed. He shook the hand. "Thank you," he replied. "Nice to see you again." Howard smiled. "You were always there, weren't you? Back of the room, volunteer nights, student tutoring. I remember seeing you fix the heater in the lounge one winter. No one ever said thank you, but I saw it." Benjamin didn't shift. He nodded once. "It needed fixing." Howard chuckled. "Funny thing about places like this. They're good at naming buildings after donors, but not so good at remembering who kept the lights on." Benjamin offered a small nod, but his expression didn't change. Howard hesitated, then added, "I hope today changes that. I hope people see what I've seen." Benjamin looked at him. "That's not why I came." Howard's voice softened. "I know. That's why it matters." The conversation ended without fanfare. Howard gave a respectful nod and returned to his seat near the faculty section. Benjamin remained standing. A few minutes later, a security officer, one of the campus veterans who had been working these events for years, made his usual slow walk through the side aisles. He recognized Benjamin immediately, paused, nodded. "Didn't expect to see you again," the officer said under his breath. Benjamin smiled faintly. "Didn't expect to be here." "Still walking in and out like a ghost," the officer said. "You know, my cousin still talks about that night class you used to help out with. Said he would have failed stats if not for you." Benjamin gave a light shrug. "He did the work." The officer laughed once and patted him on the arm. "Some of us noticed, even if we didn't say it." Benjamin nodded in thanks. The officer moved on. Not far from them, near the back entrance, the director of the university's outreach scholarship program sat flipping through her notes. She was reviewing a speech she might have to give, depending on timing. When she looked up, her eyes caught Benjamin's silhouette against the light from the windows. For a brief second, her expression changed. Recognition, then understanding. She didn't stand, didn't wave, but she gave a single slow nod. And though no one else saw it, Benjamin did, and that was enough. Amelia, still seated near the center aisle, caught fragments of all of this in her periphery. The handshake, the officer's pause, the small nod. She didn't speak, but she felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. For years she had watched him move through spaces like this, respected by those who knew better, ignored by those who didn't want to know. Now, just for a moment, there was acknowledgement, not loud, not dramatic, but real. Still, for every person who saw, there were 10 who didn't. A woman in a navy blue suit brushed past Benjamin and clutched her purse a little tighter. A young man in a pinstriped jacket moved to stand on the other side of the pillar instead. A group of parents glanced over, saw him, then quickly looked away. The room hadn't changed, not really, but a few people inside it had, and that was something. Benjamin remained where he was, silent still, not invisible, just unclaimed. The auditorium itself hadn't changed, but the energy inside it had. The lights dimmed further as the Chancellor stepped up to the podium, her voice amplified just enough to reach every corner of the room without overwhelming it. The formal opening remarks began, welcoming families, recognizing faculty, thanking donors, the usual rhythm of academic celebration. But something in the air was shifting, and those who were paying attention could feel it before they could name it. The speeches moved forward with practiced elegance, and the graduates sat straight, programs folded neatly in their laps. Near the side wall, Benjamin remained still, the program held lightly in both hands. Now the edges curled slightly from the pressure of his thumbs. He was listening, but not leaning in. He was present, but not part of the frame. Then the student speaker was introduced, a tall young woman with a confident gait, a calm presence, and a voice trained for clarity. Her name was Clara Mendoza. Amelia had seen her around campus, but never spoken to her. Clara was known for her resilience, her volunteer work, her thoughtful writing. She reached the podium and took a slow breath before speaking. The room stilled. "I want to thank this institution," she began, "for giving people like me a place to grow, to be challenged, to matter. But before I speak about today, I want to tell you a story that's been with me for almost 10 years, a story I've never shared in public until now." There was a pause, not dramatic but intentional, the kind that draws people in without forcing them. Benjamin shifted slightly. Amelia noticed. Clara continued. "When I was 14, I was riding the subway home with my brother. We were on the lower platform of the 7th Street station. It was cold, and I remember arguing with him over who would carry the backpack. Then everything went black. A rustle moved through the room, not of discomfort, but rapt attention. Clara's tone stayed steady. There was a sound I can't describe. Like metal screaming, then smoke, then panic. People started running. Some were hurt, some were trapped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see. I remember reaching out and feeling nothing but the floor. I thought I was going to die there." In the side aisle, Benjamin's fingers curled slightly around the folded edges of his program. His shoulders rose just once, then settled. He didn't blink. "But then," Clara said, her voice tightening, "two hands grabbed me. Firm, steady hands. They didn't shake. They didn't rush. They pulled me up, dragged me away from the fire. I remember coughing so hard I couldn't speak. I didn't see his face, but I remember his jacket. It was too big, and it smelled faintly of engine grease and old fabric softener. He had on work boots, scuffed at the toes. One of the laces was taped together with electrical tape. His hands were dark, strong, like someone who works with tools every day. He held me like I was glass, and the world was falling apart." Gasps echoed softly from scattered rows. A few audience members exchanged glances. One whispered, "That was the subway Samaritan story." Clara nodded, as if she heard them. "I never found out who he was. The news ran stories for weeks looking for him, but he never came forward. No interviews, no credit, just silence. And I carried that story with me. I carry it still. And today, as I stand here, I want to say thank you, even if he never hears it. Thank you for saving my life." A long pause followed her final words, the kind that hangs in the air like a held breath. The Chancellor stepped forward and thanked Clara for her powerful message. Applause followed, measured, respectful, slightly delayed as people absorbed what they'd heard. Amelia was not clapping. She was watching Benjamin. He had not moved. His hands were still, but his jaw was set. His eyes were not blinking as often, and there was a tension in his posture. She had seen it before once when she was 16 and had come home crying after a teacher assumed she had cheated on her exam because her last name didn't match her GPA. She turned toward him more fully now, her breath slowing. She had never heard the story before, but something about the details, the timing, the way Clara described those hands. It wasn't evidence, it was instinct. It was the way you know your house by sound in the dark. She looked at him for confirmation. He didn't look back. Near the back of the hall, someone else whispered, "Didn't he pull out like 8 people, I remember?" Another voice chimed in. "They said he vanished before anyone could talk to him. They said he used his shirt to stop someone's bleeding. Didn't even leave a name." Benjamin stood in profile, his eyes on the stage, but his grip on the program had deepened. The crease now ran sharp along the centerfold. His feet were planted shoulder-width apart, still calm, still silent. But Amelia saw everything, the restraint, the memory flickering just behind his eyes, the emotion pushed deep where it couldn't interrupt the moment. He didn't need to say a word, and she didn't need to ask. Back on stage, Clara had taken her seat again, and the ceremony resumed. Names were called. Degrees announced. The air slowly reset itself, as if pretending it hadn't just touched something sacred. But Amelia couldn't go back to the program, not yet. Her mind replayed Clara's words. Her heart pounded louder than the applause, and for the first time since this morning, she realized she might not know everything about the man who raised her. Benjamin remained by the wall. The room moved on, but the story had already been planted, and the story was not done. The program resumed with a steady rhythm. Names continued to be read. Graduates filed across the stage. Handshakes were exchanged. Smiles were posed for cameras. Parents clapped, some standing awkwardly for quick pictures, others dabbing at proud tears. The ceremony was moving forward, the way such ceremonies always do, predictably, with reverence and formality. But for Amelia, everything had changed. The words Clara Mendoza had spoken still echoed in her chest, tightening around her ribs. She kept glancing toward Benjamin, who stood just where he had before, back straight, shoulders relaxed, but his grip on the program had not loosened. There was something brewing under that stillness now, something unspoken and heavy. Then the Chancellor returned to the podium. She adjusted the microphone slowly and paused, letting the silence settle across the room. She did not open the program again. Instead, she looked out across the audience and smiled gently, warm, measured, the kind of smile that told everyone something unscripted was coming. "Before we close today's celebration," she began, her voice carrying clearly without being loud, "we have one final recognition." Amelia sat up straighter. So did several faculty members. Even a few parents paused mid-conversation. The Chancellor continued, "This award is not printed in your program. It is a special commendation, one reserved for rare individuals who embody the spirit of integrity, selflessness, and enduring impact on our community." The room hushed. Chairs stopped shifting. A few people leaned forward slightly, sensing a pivotal moment. "For months, we worked quietly to confirm details," the Chancellor said. "For years, many of us only knew pieces of a larger story, but what we've learned over time is that some heroes do not step into the spotlight. They require us to bring the light to them." A quiet ripple of curiosity passed through the room. "Over a decade ago," she said, "during a tragic incident in the 7th Street subway station, one man, without any formal training, without protective gear, rushed into danger while others fled. He pulled victims from wreckage, performed first aid using nothing but his shirt and his hands, and then disappeared before authorities arrived. He gave no name, claimed no recognition, and quietly walked away." Murmurs began. A few whispered, "Is this about the subway Samaritan?" "Since then," the Chancellor said, her voice warming, "that story has lived in fragments. But recently, through our alumni outreach program and a series of scholarship endowments traced back to anonymous donors, we found a name." Amelia's pulse quickened, her hand tightening around the armrest. "We also found students, graduates, many in this room, who were mentored, guided, supported by this same man." A man who showed up not for praise, not for position, but because someone needed him. She paused. He never asked for a seat at the table. He often didn't get one. He didn't wear the clothes that got noticed. He didn't carry a title. But his presence changed lives. One of those lives is a graduate sitting here today, and countless others have been shaped by his quiet strength. Amelia could barely breathe, her heartbeat so loud it felt like it was echoing off the walls. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Chancellor said, looking out toward the back of the auditorium where he still stood, "please join me in honoring Mr. Benjamin Cole." The name dropped into the room like a stone into water. For a second, everything was still. Then, slowly, a few heads turned. A few gasps, barely audible. Then silence again. Amelia was the first to rise. Her hands came together, applause ringing out with precision. Then others followed. Row by row, chairs shifted as people stood. Hands met hands. And applause swelled like a wave expanding through the room, not chaotic, but full, deep, respectful, meaningful. Benjamin didn't move at first. His eyes widened just slightly. He looked at the Chancellor, then at Amelia. The noise around him grew, but he stood frozen, as if trying to understand if this was truly meant for him. From the front, Amelia nodded once, firm, steady, her eyes glassy with pride, and slowly Benjamin took a step forward. He walked down the aisle, not with swagger, not with self-consciousness, but with quiet clarity. His shoes tapped against the floor, soft but deliberate. The applause did not fade. If anything, it grew louder, richer, as people saw what they had missed before. The man they had mistaken for a janitor or a driver was walking toward the stage. The Griffith family remained seated. Alva's mouth was slightly open. Sapphire had her eyes fixed on her program, now crumpled in her grip. Rosalind, watching remotely from home, leaned closer to her screen, frozen. Benjamin reached the steps. A faculty member extended a hand to help him up. He nodded politely, but climbed unassisted. His movements were precise, cautious, but strong. The Chancellor stepped aside and gestured toward the microphone. Benjamin stood before it, blinking once. The applause still filled the room. He waited, not asking for silence, but letting it settle on its own, and slowly the room quieted. The claps faded. Phones stopped recording. Even the air seemed to pause. He cleared his throat. "I wasn't expecting this," he said, his voice calm, worn, but firm. "I came here today just to see my daughter graduate." He glanced toward Amelia. Her eyes met his. "I'm not good with speeches, but I'll say this. I didn't do what I did that day for a plaque. I didn't run into that subway for a thank you. I just saw people who needed help, and I was close." "That's it." There was a long, drawn-out breath across the crowd. "I don't have a fancy degree," he said. "I didn't finish school myself, but I believe in showing up. Not once, not when it's convenient. Always. Every time. That's what someone did for me, and that's what I've tried to do for others." He looked down for a second, then back at the crowd. "You don't need a title to be someone's reason to keep going. Sometimes you just need to stay." He stepped back. The Chancellor placed the engraved plaque into his hands. He looked at it, not as if he didn't believe it, but as if he wasn't sure how to hold something like that. Then the applause returned, and this time it was thunderous. Benjamin stood there, the plaque heavy in his hand, the microphone standing before him like a question, waiting for an answer. His shoulders lifted with a slow breath and then lowered again, as if the weight of everything, the moment, the room, the memories, was being adjusted, rebalanced inside him. The applause had finally settled into a quiet reverence, not silence, but something softer, something that asked not for more noise, but for meaning. He looked up, eyes scanning the crowd briefly, not seeking approval, not even understanding, just taking in the fact that they were looking, that they were listening, that for the first time in a long time they weren't looking past him. "I'm not used to this," he began, his voice low but clear. "I don't speak in front of crowds. I wasn't raised to talk a lot about myself. I was raised to work, to show up, and to stay quiet unless something really needed saying." He paused, fingers grazing the edge of the plaque, eyes flicking to Amelia for a moment. "I came here today to see my daughter graduate." That was it. I wasn't expecting anything like this. The words, "my daughter," landed with intention. There was no caveat, no setup, just truth. "I know some of you probably—" He had glanced at me earlier, and honestly I hadn't thought much of it. I understood. I wasn't exactly dressed to impress. My suit was a little baggy, a bit past its prime. My shoes, well, they'd seen better days. I was aware of how people perceived me. It was a familiar gaze, one I'd encountered throughout my life. I'd been privy to the whispers, the subtle judgments. I noticed a few folks in the audience fidgeting, visibly uncomfortable. He didn't soften his expression, remained stoic. But that wasn't the reason I was standing there. I was standing there because someone, somewhere, decided to delve a little deeper. Someone remembered. Someone saw beyond the surface, saw what most people never bothered to inquire about. He gave the microphone a slight adjustment. "The day of the subway explosion, I didn't think. I simply reacted. I heard the roar, saw the billowing smoke. People were scrambling, screaming, and I just moved. I didn't pause to consider who they were, what the potential consequences might be for me. I just saw a child, trapped under rubble, and the thought that flashed through my mind was, if I don't help, who will?" The auditorium was hushed, completely silent. I left after the paramedics arrived because I wasn't looking for accolades. I just figured those who needed help received it, and that was sufficient. But even after all that, I couldn't shake it off. Their faces would appear in my dreams at times, and I knew I needed to do something more, something beyond that single act. So, whenever I could, I gave back quietly, anonymously. I helped fund some of the programs at this school, specifically the ones that gave folks like me a shot. Not because I had money to burn. I didn't. But because I remembered all too well what it felt like to be in need of assistance and have no one step up. He swallowed hard, the emotion catching in his throat. His hand clenched the edge of the lectern for a fleeting moment, a visible sign of his inner struggle. "And then there's Amelia," he said, his voice thick with affection. "She was 10 years old when her father walked out, just left. One bag and a pathetic excuse about needing time to figure things out. I remember her face that day so vividly. She didn't cry. Not then, at least. She just sat there on the couch, small and radiating a quiet, contained anger, waiting for someone to return. Her mom, well, she had her own methods of coping. But I knew right then and there what I had to do." He looked straight ahead, his gaze unwavering. I didn't try to step into her father's shoes, didn't try to replace him. I didn't try to be the man he should have been. I just stayed put. I made her breakfast in the mornings. I drove her to school. I helped her with those agonizing science fair projects, even though I didn't even finish high school myself. I read books with her, real slow, sounding out the words. Even when I stumbled over the pronunciations, I sat through her excruciating violin recitals, and I clapped enthusiastically. Even when she hit all the wrong notes, I showed up, consistently, reliably. His voice remained steady, despite the emotion. And over the years, she gradually let me into her world. Not always with words, not always overtly, but in the subtle ways, like when she started calling me Dad without even realizing it. In the way she'd leave me a little note when I worked late, or save me a piece of cake after school events. In the way she reached for my hand at events like this, not because she was embarrassed to be seen with me, but because she didn't want me to feel alone. He glanced at her again, his eyes filled with love. She's not my blood, but she's my heart. I wasn't born her father, but I became one through choice, through time, through simply being present. Amelia's hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes locked on him, her breathing shallow and steady. "I don't need this plaque," he said quietly, his voice laced with sincerity. "Not to know what I've done, not to feel any prouder of who she's become. But maybe it's beneficial that someone said it out loud, made it public. Maybe it's good for the people who never inquired, never truly saw. Maybe it's time they finally did." He paused one final time, gathering his thoughts. "I never imagined anyone noticed, but I guess they do." With that, Benjamin stepped back from the lectern. He didn't bow theatrically. He didn't plaster on a broad, insincere smile. He simply nodded once, a gesture of quiet dignity, and stepped away from the microphone. As the applause swelled again, this time not in a gentle wave, but in a roaring tempest of sound, a standing ovation erupted, louder, more unified than anything before. People who had been silent earlier now stood, clapping with both hands, some with tears streaming down their cheeks. Professors, staff, students, complete strangers. The very individuals who had once looked right through him now stood for him, acknowledging him. And Amelia, standing too, felt her chest swell with a pride so overwhelming it left her breathless. Behind her, Alva Griffiths sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face a mask of carefully constructed indifference. Sapphire glanced down, her eyes red-rimmed, betraying her emotions. And somewhere far from the room, Rosalind Griffiths watched from her screen, her face unmoving, her unreadable lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes gleaming with something akin to recognition. Benjamin left the stage with the same measured, unhurried walk he'd used to enter, but this time every step landed differently. Every step echoed with the resonating sound of acknowledgement, of truth finally heard, of years unseen now rendered visible. And he did not walk alone. As he stepped down from the stage and walked slowly back toward the edge of the hall, Amelia stepped into the aisle and met him halfway. She didn't utter a word. She didn't need to. Her arms wrapped around him in a tight, quiet hug, and they stood there in the aisle, father and daughter, not by legal decree, but by everything that ever truly mattered more. The applause still echoed in some corners of the hall, but near the reserved family section, a different kind of silence had settled in, thick, awkward, and inescapable. Alva Griffiths, once so poised in her posture and so sharp in her observations, sat utterly motionless. Her hands, which had earlier clutched a flute of sparkling cider with an air of aristocratic indifference, now rested quietly in her lap. She didn't look at Amelia. She didn't look at Benjamin. Her gaze was fixed somewhere between the floor tiles and her own expensive shoes, as if she were unwilling to face the reality she'd spent years sneering at. Sapphire, seated beside her, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The same girl who had whispered about Benjamin's worn shoes now seemed significantly smaller, diminished in her chair. Her polished expression had dulled into something far more human: uncertainty. Her brows were furrowed in thought. Her lips parted slightly in a silent question. Then she leaned toward her father and whispered, "Why didn't we ever hear about him before?" Her father, a man usually so eager to lecture or assert his opinions, merely sighed through his nose and stared forward. He had no answer, none that would sound remotely right anymore. From behind their row, a woman, one of the Griffiths' distant cousins, who earlier had laughed about Benjamin looking like part of the maintenance crew, stood up slowly, hesitated visibly, then walked around to the side of the aisle. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor. Her face was taut, her eyes darting anxiously between Benjamin and the floor, as though she feared her own voice might betray her true feelings. She finally reached him just as he was preparing to leave the aisle with Amelia. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know." Benjamin turned his head, his face unreadable but composed, betraying no emotion. He studied her for a brief moment, not judging, not offering any warmth either, just waiting. "You didn't ask," he said simply, his voice even and devoid of any accusation. She opened her mouth as if to offer an explanation, then closed it again. There was nothing more to say, no justification that would suffice. She gave a nod, almost imperceptible, and stepped back into the shadows from which she came. Amelia watched this exchange quietly, her arm still linked with Benjamin's. Her heart pounded, not with anger, not even with a sense of vindication, but with something far more complex, something that existed somewhere between pain and profound peace. She didn't feel triumphant, not at all. She felt settled, grounded. As they walked down the aisle toward the back of the auditorium, small clusters of guests parted to let them pass. No more snide laughter, no more furtive glances, just silence, and, in some faces, a glimmer of honest reflection. Professor Howard nodded respectfully again. A janitor standing near the exit stood a little straighter, as if he were witnessing something sacred, something truly profound. At the edge of the room, one last voice called out softly, "Mr. Cole." It was Dean Russell, who had stepped forward from the front row, his expression warm and deliberate. "Please join us. We've arranged a seat for you. Next to Amelia. It's where you've always belonged." Benjamin blinked slightly, caught completely off guard by the unexpected invitation. He glanced at Amelia, who gave him a small nod of encouragement, her hand gently squeezing his arm. Without speaking, he turned and followed her back down the aisle, not toward the doors and an escape, but toward the front, toward the light. This time, people didn't merely part to make way for them. They leaned back respectfully, their eyes no longer glancing furtively, but watching with genuine interest and purpose. Benjamin walked with the same quiet dignity that had always characterized him. But now each step seemed to resonate with something heavier than applause, something more profound than mere recognition. He took the seat next to Amelia, the one that had remained conspicuously empty all this time. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly around them, not louder, not grander, but fuller, richer. There was no formal announcement, no dramatic spotlight illuminating them, just a chair finally filled and a place finally honored. The rest of the family section sat still, unsure of how to react, unsure of what to say. Alva crossed her arms tightly, her face a mask of disapproval. Sapphire stared straight ahead, blinking rapidly, trying to maintain her composure. None of them moved, none of them spoke, and that silence, unlike the one that had preceded it, was not born of indifference. It was the sound of understanding finally arriving, late and clumsy, but undeniably real. Inside that simple act of sitting down, Benjamin reclaimed what had never actually been offered to him, not because someone magnanimously bestowed it upon him, but because it was already rightfully his. It was, and had always been, his seat. The house was quiet. Not the unsettling silence that comes with a palpable absence, but the serene quiet that descends after a tumultuous storm, when the wind has finally subsided, the dust has settled, and there's nothing left but the sound of gentle breathing and a pervasive sense of stillness. Late afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the sheer curtains, casting long, golden stripes across the polished living room floor. The ceiling fan rotated lazily, the soft whir of its blades barely audible beneath the distant hum of a lawn-mower operating somewhere across the street. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked once, then again, but other than that, the world outside was calm. Amelia stood in front of the refrigerator, two framed items held carefully in her hands. One was a drawing she had made when she was just a child, probably in 3rd grade. The lines were clumsy, the colors filled in with uneven strokes of crayon. A tall figure, dark-haired and smiling, stood protectively beside a small, crudely drawn house. On the bottom corner, in shaky, childlike handwriting, the words read, "My hero Benjamin." The second frame was new. It had only been printed that morning. A photograph taken during the emotional moment he stood on stage, the spotlight wrapping around him like a quiet crown. The metal of the medal around his neck gleamed against his worn blazer. Behind him, a blurry crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation, their applause frozen in time. His eyes looked out at the world, conveying a mix of shock, pride, and lingering uncertainty. She stared at the old drawing for a long moment, her fingers gently grazing the worn edge of the frame. The tape securing it had yellowed with age, the corners curled and peeling. It had lived on that refrigerator door for over a decade, witnessing countless school years, science fairs, heartbreaks, and moments of growth. It had been a constant presence, a silent symbol, a private truth that only they had ever acknowledged. A quiet declaration of love and admiration rendered in a child's simple scrawl. With deliberate care, she walked over to the bookshelf, opened a wooden memory box, and laid the drawing gently inside. It didn't belong in the public spotlight anymore, but it deserved reverence, deserved to be cherished. She closed the lid softly, her breath catching in her throat for just a second, then turned back to the refrigerator. She placed the new photo in the center of the door, making sure it was straight and level. She stepped back and looked at it, assessing its placement. There was no grand ceremony, no public announcement, just a subtle shift from a private memory to a publicly acknowledged truth. Behind her, Benjamin walked into the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He paused when he saw the new photo prominently displayed on the refrigerator. His eyes remained fixed on it for a long while, taking it all in, then drifted to her, meeting her gaze. He didn't smile right away. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that transcended words. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his voice laced with a quiet humility. "I know," Amelia replied, her voice calm but thick with emotion. "But I wanted the world to see what I've always seen, what I've always known." He nodded slowly. No argument, no false modesty, no protest. He understood perfectly. That was enough. Back in the living room, the couch creaked gently as they sat down together, not touching, not speaking, just sitting side by side in the kind of companionable silence that wasn't empty or awkward but full of unspoken understanding. The TV was off, silent. The world outside carried on, indifferent to their private moment. But something in their home had subtly shifted, not in any dramatic noise or structural change, but in its very gravity, in its sense of placement. Benjamin leaned back, his arms resting loosely on the worn couch cushions. He was still wearing the same shirt he'd had on earlier, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, the fabric now faintly wrinkled from the long and emotionally taxing day. His hands, those familiar, calloused hands that had always been there, rested open and relaxed on his knees. His breathing was even and unhurried. Amelia glanced at him, noticing the way the light caught the silver grey at his temples, the way his jaw remained steady and strong even now. There was a time when she used to look at him and wonder why he didn't say more, why he didn't push back when people dismissed him or overlooked him. But now she finally understood. He never needed noise to prove his worth. He just needed space, deserved space. And now he finally had it. He turned his head slightly, catching her gaze. "You all right?" he asked softly. She gave a small, reassuring nod. "Yeah," she said. "You?" His smile was soft and genuine. "I will be," he replied. They didn't speak for a while after that. They didn't need to. Outside, the distant laughter of children echoed faintly from somewhere down the street. The sweet scent of the half-eaten chocolate cake still lingered pleasantly in the air, the same kind of simple cake Benjamin always picked up when there was something worth celebrating, even if it was just making it through a particularly hard week. Amelia rose after a few minutes and walked over to the coffee table where the cake sat. She cut a generous slice for herself, then another for him, carried them back to the coffee table, and handed one to him. He took it with a simple, heartfelt thanks, and they ate in comfortable silence, the soft clinking of their forks against the plates, the only sound. As they finished, she looked slowly around the room, taking it all in. It wasn't grand or luxurious. The couch was old and well-worn. The rug had a small tear on the edge, subtly covered by the furniture. But every inch of it felt like home, felt sacred. Every scratch on the old coffee table, every photograph on the wall, they all told the story of a man who didn't build a mansion filled with expensive things, but instead built something far stronger, something far more enduring, a life that held, a life that mattered. She leaned her head against the back of the couch and closed her eyes for a second, letting the peace wash over her. "You know," she said softly, breaking the silence, "I used to be so angry about it, that people didn't see you, that they just thought you were part of the background, invisible." He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was calm and devoid of any bitterness. "People see what they want to see," he said quietly. "Some folks need a grand stage to understand something. Others just don't look up unless there's a spotlight shining right in their eyes." She nodded, understanding. "But they looked today," she said. "Yeah," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Today they did." There was a deep sense of peace in that simple statement, not satisfaction, not revenge, just pure, unadulterated peace. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the living room floor. The moment didn't try to be profound or meaningful, it simply was. No camera flashes, no grand speeches, just a girl and her father sitting quietly in a room filled with a profound, unspoken pride. Nothing more needed to be said, because in that shared space, in that profound stillness, everything had finally been heard. Everything had finally been understood. If you're still here, listening until the very end, thank you. Truly, stories like this aren't always easy to sit with, aren't always easy to absorb. They're quiet and understated. They breathe slowly, but they carry a significant weight. The kind of weight made of dignity, of quiet strength, of a love that never asked to be noticed or celebrated, but never stopped giving, never stopped supporting. Benjamin never raised his voice in anger. He never demanded attention or recognition, but sometimes the loudest, most powerful truths reside in the people who simply stay, who endure. Through every door that closed in their faces, through every moment they were overlooked or dismissed, through every time someone asked, "Who is that man?" and never bothered to learn the answer, their quiet strength persevered. So now, I want to ask you, where are you listening from? What part of the world did this story find you in? And, more importantly, how did it make you feel? Was there a part of Benjamin that reminded you of someone in your own life? A person who stood quietly in the background, holding everything together, supporting everyone else's dreams? Or maybe you saw a piece of yourself in Amelia, carrying both a deep love and a lingering longing, a profound pride mixed with a quiet, persistent pain. Please share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. Whether it's just a single sentence or a whole story of your own, your voice matters here. This space is for recognition, for reflection, and above all for remembering that greatness doesn't always look the way people expect it to, doesn't always come in the form they anticipate. If this story touched something deep within you, let it sit, let it breathe, allow it to resonate within your soul. And when you're ready, we'll be here, waiting to share the next story with you. Join us in celebrating and sharing meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you can start each day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.